When we think of Prussia today, we imagine disciplined soldiers marching in perfect formation, their boots clicking against cobblestone streets. We picture grand palaces rising from northern plains and philosophers debating in candlelit rooms. Prussia gave the world military precision, educational excellence, and a unique blend of order and enlightenment that shaped modern Europe in ways we still feel today. The transformation of Prussia from a pagan Baltic territory into a Christian state began with the arrival of warriors wearing white mantles marked with black crosses. The Teutonic Knights, originally founded during the Crusades to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, found their true destiny in the cold forests along the Baltic Sea. Their story is one of religious fervour mixing with political ambition, of castle building and culture clash, of a military order that would lay the foundations for a future kingdom. Picture the scene in 1226 when Duke Conrad of Masovia, desperate to protect his Polish territories from raids by pagan Prussian tribes, invited the Teutonic Knights to help him. The Duke probably imagined he was hiring temporary military assistance, much like calling in mercenaries to deal with a specific problem. He couldn't have imagined that this decision would reshape the entire region for centuries to come. The knights arrived not as temporary helpers but as permanent settlers, bringing with them stoneworking skills, military discipline, and an unshakable belief in their divine mission. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Hermann von Salza, was far more than a military commander. He was a skilled diplomat who understood that lasting power required legal foundations as solid as castle walls. Before committing his knights to the Prussian venture, he secured the Golden Bull of Rimini from Emperor Frederick II in 1226. This document granted the order sovereign rights over any territories they conquered from the pagans. With papal blessings and imperial authorization, the knights weren't just invaders. They were legally sanctioned state builders. The native Prussians who faced this invasion were not the primitive barbarians that Christian chronicles often portrayed. They had their own sophisticated culture, with skilled metalworkers who created intricate jewellery, farmers who knew every secret of their harsh land, and warriors who fought with tactics adapted perfectly to their forested homeland. They worshipped gods of nature, particularly the thunder god Perkunos, in sacred groves where ancient oaks were believed to connect earth and sky. Their society was organised into tribes, each led by nobles who earned their positions through wisdom and war prowess rather than inheritance. When the Teutonic Knights began their systematic conquest in 1230, they brought a completely different way of war. Where Prussian warriors fought as individual heroes seeking personal glory, the knights fought as a disciplined unit, each man's actions coordinated with his brothers. They built castles not just as fortifications but as permanent statements of power, massive stone structures that dominated the landscape and proclaimed that the new masters were here to stay. The construction of Marienburg Castle, which would become the order's headquarters, began in 1274 on the banks of the Nogat River. Imagine the scene as hundreds of workers, some local converts, others brought from Germany, laboured to raise red brick walls that seemed to touch the sky. The castle wasn't just a military fortress, it was a complete world unto itself, with chapels for prayer, halls for governance, workshops for craftsmen, and storehouses that could sustain a siege for months. The architecture combined military pragmatism with religious symbolism, every tower and gateway designed to inspire both fear and awe. The knights' approach to conquest followed a methodical pattern that would echo through Prussian history. First came military expeditions, usually in winter when frozen rivers became highways and swamps turned solid. Then came castle construction at strategic points, controlling river crossings and trade routes. Finally came colonization, as the knights invited German settlers to establish villages and towns under their protection. Each stage reinforced the others, creating a system that gradually transformed the entire region. The process of Christianization was complex and often brutal. The knights demanded that conquered Prussians accept baptism, but conversion at sword point rarely creates genuine believers. Many Prussians maintained their old beliefs in secret, gathering in hidden groves to honour their ancient gods. The knights responded with harsh laws against paganism, destroying sacred sites and punishing those caught practicing old rituals. Yet over time, a syncretic culture emerged, with Christian holidays absorbing elements of pagan festivals, and old Prussian customs surviving under new Christian names. The economic transformation under the knights was equally profound. They introduced three-field crop rotation, replacing the slash-and-burn agriculture that Prussians had practiced. Water mills appeared along rivers, grinding grain more efficiently than hand mills ever could. The knights established towns with German law, granting merchants and craftsmen privileges that attracted settlers from across the Holy Roman Empire. Markets held on specific days brought together German colonists and Prussian natives, creating spaces where cultures mixed despite official segregation. The order's administrative system was remarkably sophisticated for its time. They divided conquered territories into commanderies, each governed by a knight brother who reported to regional commanders, who in turn answered to the Grand Master. Records were meticulously kept in Latin and later in German, documenting everything from grain harvests to military campaigns. This bureaucratic tradition, emphasizing written documentation and hierarchical organization, would become a defining characteristic of Prussian governance. The Teutonic Knights also established a unique relationship between military service and land ownership. Knights who distinguished themselves in battle received estates to govern, but these lands remained property of the order rather than becoming personal possessions. This system prevented the fragmentation of territory that plagued other medieval states, while ensuring that leadership positions went to those who had proven their competence, rather than simply inheriting them. Education under the knights focused primarily on training future members of the order and administrators for their growing state. Cathedral schools in major towns taught Latin, theology, and basic administrative skills. The knights also established one of Europe's earliest systems of rural schools, simple institutions where village priests taught local children basic prayers and perhaps rudimentary reading. This emphasis on education, limited though it was, planted seeds that would later bloom into Prussia's renowned educational system. The order's relationship with the Polish kingdom was consistently tense and often hostile. While Polish dukes had initially invited the knights to help against pagan Prussians, they soon realized they had exchanged one troublesome neighbour for a far more dangerous one. The knights' state cut Poland off from the Baltic Sea, controlling crucial trade routes and growing wealthy from amber exports and grain shipments. Wars between Poland and the Teutonic Order became regular occurrences, each side claiming divine support for their cause. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410 marked a turning point in the Order's history. On a hot July day, the combined forces of Poland and Lithuania faced the Teutonic Knights on a field between three villages. The Knights, supremely confident in their military superiority, attacked with their traditional, disciplined charge. But the Polish-Lithuanian forces, larger and employing innovative tactics, surrounded and destroyed much of the Order's army. The Grand Master himself fell in battle, along with most of the senior leadership. Though the Order survived Grunwald and even retained most of its territory, the battle shattered the myth of Teutonic invincibility. The enormous cost of ransoming captured knights and rebuilding military forces strained the Order's finances. More importantly, The defeat emboldened internal opposition from Prussian towns and native nobility who had long resented the Knights' authoritarian rule. The careful balance of military might, economic control, and religious authority that had sustained the order began to crumble. The 13 Years' War, from 1454 to 1466, saw the Prussian Confederation, an alliance of towns and nobles, rebel against the order with Polish support. The conflict devastated the countryside as armies marched back and forth, burning villages and besieging castles. The Knights, no longer able to recruit sufficient members from Germany and lacking funds to hire mercenaries, gradually lost control of their territories. The Second Peace of Thorn in 1466 forced the order to cede Western Prussia to Poland while retaining Eastern Prussia as a Polish fief. This transformation, from sovereign state to vassal, marks the beginning of the order's evolution from military religious organization to secular territorial ruler. Grand Masters increasingly came from German noble families who viewed the position as a stepping stone to greater power rather than a religious calling. The knights themselves, once celibate warrior monks, began to question vows that seemed increasingly irrelevant to their actual circumstances. The Protestant Reformation provided the final catalyst for transformation. When Martin Luther's ideas reached Prussia in the 1520s, they found receptive audiences among both German colonists and native Prussians who had long resented the Catholic order's domination. Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, recognizing which way the wind was blowing, made a decision that would have been unthinkable to earlier knights. In 1525, he converted to Lutheranism, secularized the order's Prussian territories, and transformed them into the hereditary Duchy of Prussia, with himself as Duke. This secularization was more than just a change in leadership. It represented a fundamental transformation of Prussian society. Church lands became ducal property or were distributed to nobles who supported the transformation. Monasteries were dissolved, their libraries and treasures absorbed into ducal collections or dispersed. The administrative structure created by the knights remained largely intact but now served secular rather than religious purposes. The legacy of the Teutonic Knights in Prussia was complex and lasting. They had brought Germanic language and culture to the region, establishing patterns of settlement and governance that would endure for centuries. Their emphasis on military discipline, administrative efficiency, and territorial expansion became core elements of Prussian state identity. The castle fortresses they built remained symbols of power long after the knights themselves had vanished, stone reminders of an age when religious faith and military might were inseparable. Yet the knights also left darker legacies. Their brutal suppression of Prussian paganism contributed to the near extinction of the old Prussian language and culture. Their authoritarian governance style, with power concentrated in a military elite, established precedents that would echo through Prussian history. The tension between German colonists and native populations, between military necessity and economic development, between authoritarian efficiency and local autonomy, all had roots in the Teutonic period, the Duchy of Prussia and Brandenburg Union. The year 1525 marked a profound transformation when the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights knelt before the Polish king in the market square of Krakow. Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, wearing secular clothes instead of the white mantle of his order, placed his hands between those of King Sigismund I of Poland and swore an oath of feudal loyalty. This moment, known as the Prussian Homage, created the Duchy of Prussia and set in motion events that would eventually unite Prussia with Brandenburg, forming the foundation of a future kingdom. Duke Albert, as he was now known, faced the monumental task of transforming a religious military order's territory into a functioning secular state. The challenges were immense. Many of the Teutonic Knights refused to accept secularization, fleeing to the order's remaining territories in the Holy Roman Empire. Local nobles, long suppressed under the order's authoritarian rule, demanded greater privileges and autonomy. The common people, confused by rapid religious changes, needed reassurance that their daily lives wouldn't be thrown into chaos. Albert approached these challenges with remarkable pragmatism. Rather than attempting to maintain the order's centralized control, he negotiated with local nobles, granting them hereditary rights to their estates in exchange for military service and political support. This creation of a landed aristocracy, the Junkers as they would later be called, established a social class that would dominate Prussian society for centuries. These nobles weren't just landowners. They became the backbone of Prussian military and administrative systems, their sons serving as officers and officials generation after generation. The establishment of Lutheranism as the official religion of the duchy required careful handling. Albert invited Protestant theologians from Wittenberg to help establish new church structures and educational institutions. The University of Königsberg, founded in 1544, became a centre of Protestant learning that attracted students from across Northern Europe. The university wasn't just about theology, it taught law, medicine, and philosophy, becoming an intellectual beacon in what had been considered a peripheral region. The transformation of former church properties created opportunities for economic development. Monastery lands were converted into ducal estates or granted to nobles and wealthy merchants. Former monks who chose to remain were often employed as teachers or administrators, their literacy and organisational skills too valuable to waste. The secularisation of church wealth funded new initiatives in education, infrastructure, and military development, though it also enriched the Duke and his supporters. Albert's relationship with Poland remained complex and often tense. As a vassal of the Polish crown, he was required to provide military support and attend Polish royal ceremonies. Yet he constantly sought to maximise his autonomy, corresponding with German princes and even the Holy Roman Emperor about potential alternatives to Polish overlordship. This delicate balancing act, maintaining formal subordination while pursuing practical independence, would characterise Prussian diplomacy for decades. The duchy's population was remarkably diverse for its time. German colonists dominated towns and many rural areas, but Polish communities existed along the southern borders. Lithuanian settlements dotted the eastern regions, and remnants of the old Prussian population survived in remote areas. Each group maintained its own customs, languages, and legal traditions, creating a complex mosaic that required careful management. Duke Albert and his successors generally pursued a policy of gradual Germanization, encouraging German settlement and making German the language of administration and law, but they also recognized the need to accommodate other populations to maintain stability. Economic development under the duchy focused on agricultural improvement and commercial expansion. The vast estates of eastern Prussia produced grain that fed growing cities in Western Europe. Königsberg became a major port, shipping amber, timber, and agricultural products, while importing manufactured goods and luxuries. The Duke encouraged Dutch and German craftsmen to settle in towns, bringing new techniques in everything from brewing to clockmaking. This economic growth created prosperity, but also increased social stratification, as successful merchants and efficient estate owners accumulated wealth while small farmers and labourers struggled. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on literacy had profound effects on Prussian society. Luther's translation of the Bible into German meant that ordinary people needed to learn to read to fully participate in religious life. Duke Albert mandated that each parish establish a school, though implementation varied widely depending on local resources and enthusiasm. These parish schools, however simple, began the long process of mass education that would eventually make Prussia famous for its literate population. The role of women in ducal Prussia reflected both Protestant ideals and practical necessities. While Luther's teachings emphasized women's roles as wives and mothers, the realities of running estates and businesses often required women to exercise considerable authority. Noble women managed vast households, supervised agricultural production when their husbands were away at war or court, and sometimes served as regents for minor children. Merchant women in towns often worked alongside their husbands in shops and could inherit and run businesses as widows. The duchy's legal system underwent significant reform as secular courts replaced ecclesiastical ones. Duke Albert commissioned new law codes that combined elements of German law, Polish statutes, and local customs. These codes attempted to standardize legal procedures across the duchy while acknowledging regional variations. The establishment of professional judges and lawyers, trained at the University of Königsberg, gradually replaced the ad hoc justice of local nobles, though the process took generations and faced considerable resistance. Military organization in the duchy reflected its precarious position between Poland and other potentially hostile powers. Unable to maintain the Teutonic Knights' professional military force, Duke Albert relied on a feudal system where nobles provided cavalry in exchange for land privileges, while towns contributed infantry and artillery. This military structure was less efficient than professional armies, but more affordable for a relatively poor duchy. Regular musters and training exercises attempted to maintain some level of military readiness, though the duchy's forces remained modest compared to its neighbours. The succession crisis that began with Duke Albert's death in 1568 revealed the fragility of the duchy's independence. His son, Albert Frederick, suffered from mental illness that progressively worsened, requiring the appointment of regents to govern in his name. These regencies became opportunities for both Polish kings and German princes to extend their influence over Prussia. The question of who would govern Prussia became entangled with broader European power struggles, particularly the rivalry between Catholic and Protestant powers. The appointment of Joachim Frederick of Brandenburg as regent in 1605 marked the beginning of Brandenburg's formal involvement in Prussian affairs. The Hohenzollern family, which ruled Brandenburg, had genealogical claims to Prussia through marriage connections. More importantly, they had the political and military strength to assert these claims despite Polish opposition. The regent governed Prussia efficiently, maintaining formal subordination to Poland while strengthening ties with Brandenburg. When Albert Frederick died in 1618 without male heirs, John Sigismund of Brandenburg inherited the duchy, creating a personal union between Brandenburg and Prussia. This union was far from smooth or automatic. The two territories were separated by Polish lands, had different legal systems, different religious compositions, and different international obligations. Brandenburg was part of the Holy Roman Empire, while Prussia remained a Polish fief. Managing these contradictions required diplomatic skill and often outright deception. The 30 Years' War, which began in the same year as the Brandenburg-Prussia Union, created both opportunities and dangers for the new dual state. While Brandenburg suffered terribly from marauding armies and economic devastation, Prussia's location on the periphery initially protected it from the worst violence. The duchy became a refuge for Protestant refugees fleeing Catholic persecution, bringing skills and capital that enriched the economy. However, the war also demonstrated Prussia's military weakness, as Swedish and Polish armies marched through the duchy almost at will. George William, who ruled Brandenburg Prussia from 1619 to 1640, struggled to maintain neutrality in the face of overwhelming pressure from all sides. His attempts to avoid commitment to either Catholic or Protestant alliances satisfied no one and left his territories vulnerable to exploitation by all belligerents. Swedish occupation of Prussia from 1626 to 1635 demonstrated the price of weakness, as Swedish armies extracted heavy contributions and recruited soldiers by force. The experience taught Prussian leaders that neutrality without military strength was impossible. The economic impact of the 30 Years' War varied dramatically across Brandenburg Prussia. While Brandenburg's population declined by perhaps half through war, plague and emigration, Prussia suffered less severely. Königsberg continued to function as a commercial centre, though trade volumes declined. Rural estates in Prussia maintained production, feeding armies and civilian populations alike. This economic resilience would prove crucial for post-war recovery, as revenues from Prussia helped finance Brandenburg's reconstruction. Cultural life during the ducal period reflected the region's position at the crossroads of different traditions. The University of Königsberg became a centre for Protestant theology, but also for emerging scientific disciplines. Scholars like Simon Dach wrote poetry that celebrated local landscapes and customs while engaging with broader European literary trends. Music flourished in both sacred and secular contexts, with church choirs and court musicians performing works by local and foreign composers. The development of Prussian identity during the ducal period was gradual and complex. The territory's inhabitants thought of themselves primarily in local or religious terms, rather than as Prussians in any national sense, yet shared experiences, particularly the transformation from Teutonic order to duchy and the challenges of maintaining autonomy between larger powers, began creating common bonds. The German language increasingly served as a lingua franca, though Polish, Lithuanian, and other languages remained important in many communities. The administrative innovations of the ducal period laid foundations for future Prussian bureaucratic efficiency. The need to coordinate between dispersed territories forced administrators to develop systematic record-keeping and communication procedures. Regular censuses, tax rolls, and land surveys created databases of information that enabled more effective governance. The practice of recruiting administrators based on education and competence, rather than just noble birth, though limited, began establishing meritocratic principles. Frederick William, who became Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia in 1640, inherited territories devastated by war, but also positioned for potential greatness. His long reign from 1640 to 1688 would transform Brandenburg Prussia from a victim of international politics into an active player. Known to history as the Great Elector, he would build the military and administrative structures that would elevate Prussia to kingdom status. But that transformation built upon foundations laid during the ducal period. The birth of the kingdom under Frederick III. The dawn of the 18th century brought a ceremony in Königsberg that would transform the map of Europe. On January 18, 1701, Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia, placed a crown upon his own head in a carefully choreographed ritual that proclaimed the birth of the Kingdom of Prussia. The choice to crown himself, rather than receiving the crown from a bishop or another monarch, sent a clear message that this new kingdom owed its existence to no external power, neither pope nor emperor. The path to this coronation had been long and complex, requiring diplomatic finesse, financial resources, and perfect timing. Frederick, who would now be known as King Frederick I, had inherited a state that his father, the Great Elector Frederick William, had strengthened militarily and administratively, but which remained politically fragmented. Brandenburg was part of the Holy Roman Empire, subject to imperial law and the emperor's theoretical supremacy. Prussia proper was still technically a fief of Poland, though Polish control had weakened considerably. Creating a kingdom from these disparate parts required navigating treacherous diplomatic waters. The opportunity came with the War of Spanish Succession, which erupted in 1700 when the death of the childless Spanish king triggered a European-wide conflict over who would inherit his vast empire. Emperor Leopold I needed allies for the coming war, particularly Protestant allies who could balance French power. Frederick seized this moment, offering the emperor 8,000 Prussian soldiers in exchange for recognition of his royal title. It was a masterful bargain where both sides got what they most needed. The negotiations were delicate and sometimes almost comical in their attention to protocol. The emperor would only recognize Frederick as King in Prussia rather than King of Prussia, since West Prussia remained under Polish control. This semantic distinction mattered enormously in the status-conscious world of European diplomacy. Frederick accepted this limitation, understanding that the reality of kingship mattered more than its precise title. Once established as a king, future expansions of the title would become possible. The coronation ceremony itself was a magnificent spectacle designed to announce Prussia's arrival on the European stage. Frederick spent enormous sums, perhaps 2 years' worth of state revenue, on the festivities. Königsberg was transformed into a glittering stage where European diplomats and nobles could witness the birth of a new kingdom. Streets were decorated with triumphal arches, fountains ran with wine for the common people, and elaborate fireworks illuminated winter skies. The ceremony blended Protestant simplicity with royal magnificence, creating a distinctly Prussian style of monarchy. Frederick's queen, Sophie Charlotte, played a crucial role in establishing the cultural credentials of the new kingdom. Born a princess of Hanover and educated in the sophisticated courts of Western Europe, she brought intellectual brilliance and artistic refinement to what many considered a backward militaristic state. She established salons where philosophers, scientists, and artists gathered to discuss the latest ideas. Her patronage of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the greatest minds of the age, demonstrated that Prussia could compete culturally as well as militarily. The establishment of the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1700, with Leibniz as its first president, preceded the coronation and signalled Frederick's ambitions for his kingdom. The academy wasn't just about prestige, it was intended to promote practical knowledge that could strengthen the state. Members studied everything from improved agricultural techniques to more efficient methods of tax collection. This combination of theoretical learning and practical application would become a hallmark of Prussian intellectual life. The new kingdom faced immediate challenges that tested its viability. The Great Northern War, which began in 1700, brought Swedish, Russian, and Polish armies dangerously close to Prussian territories. Frederick had to maintain a delicate neutrality, offering diplomatic support to various parties without committing military forces he needed elsewhere. This required maintaining a strong military presence to deter invasion, while avoiding provocative actions that might trigger attack. Domestically, Frederick faced the challenge of creating unified institutions for his geographically scattered territories. Brandenburg, Prussia proper, and various smaller holdings in Western Germany all had different legal systems, tax structures, and administrative traditions. The king's solution was to create central institutions in Berlin that would gradually supersede local variations. The General Directory, established to coordinate financial and administrative matters, became the embryo of a centralized bureaucracy that would eventually govern all Prussian territories. The economic policies of Frederick's reign reflected both ambition and limitation. The king desperately wanted to emulate the magnificence of Louis XIV's Versailles, but Prussia lacked France's wealthy economy. Frederick's attempts to maintain a glittering court, while also strengthening the military and administration, created chronic financial strain. New taxes were imposed, state monopolies on salt and other commodities were established, and efforts were made to attract wealthy immigrants who could contribute to the economy. The transformation of Berlin from a provincial town into a royal capital required massive investment. New palaces were constructed, including the magnificent Charlottenburg Palace, named after the Queen. Wide boulevards were laid out, impressive public buildings erected, and attempts made to attract artists and craftsmen from across Europe. The Unter den Linden, the grand avenue that would become Berlin's most famous street, was expanded and lined with impressive buildings. These projects provided employment and stimulated economic growth, but also drained the treasury and required heavy taxation that caused considerable grumbling among subjects who saw little direct benefit from royal magnificence. Religious policy under Frederick I reflected both personal conviction and political calculation. As a Calvinist ruler of a predominantly Lutheran population, Frederick had to navigate carefully between different Protestant denominations. His solution was a policy of religious tolerance that welcomed not only different Protestant groups, but also Catholics and even Jews, though with varying degrees of restriction. This tolerance was partly principled, but mostly practical, as Frederick recognized that religious refugees often brought valuable skills and capital. The Huguenots, French Protestants fleeing persecution after Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, found particularly warm welcome in Prussia. Frederick offered them not just refuge, but active assistance, providing funds to establish new communities and businesses. These French refugees brought sophisticated manufacturing techniques, particularly in textiles and luxury goods, that helped diversify Prussia's largely agricultural economy. Their influence extended beyond economics, as French became the language of the Prussian court, and French cultural influences shaped everything from architecture to cuisine. The development of the Prussian military during Frederick's reign laid crucial groundwork for future expansion, though Frederick himself was more interested in the appearance of military might than its actual application. The army grew from about 30,000 men at his accession to nearly 40,000 by his death, making it one of the larger forces in Europe. More importantly, administrative reforms created more efficient systems for recruiting, training, and supplying soldiers. The canton system, which would be fully developed under Frederick's successor, began taking shape during this period, assigning specific districts responsibility for providing recruits. The officer corps during Frederick's reign began developing its distinctive character as a closed caste dominated by the nobility. The Junker aristocracy, particularly from Brandenburg and Pomerania, saw military service as both a duty and a privilege. Young nobles were sent to cadet schools, where they learned not just military tactics, but also mathematics, languages, and court etiquette. This education created officers who were not just warriors, but also capable administrators who could serve the state in various capacities. The relationship between crown and nobility during Frederick's reign established patterns that would endure throughout Prussian history. Unlike Louis XIV, who had neutered French nobility by turning them into decorative courtiers, Frederick integrated Prussian nobles into state service while respecting their local privileges. Nobles retained control over their estates and the peasants who worked them, exercising judicial and administrative authority in rural areas. In exchange, they provided military service and political support for royal policies. This bargain created a uniquely Prussian form of absolutism that combined centralized royal power with aristocratic autonomy. The legal reforms initiated during Frederick's reign aimed to create greater uniformity across Prussian territories while respecting local traditions. The king commissioned legal scholars to compile comprehensive law codes that would standardize procedures while allowing for regional variations. These efforts, though not completed during Frederick's lifetime, began the process of creating a unified Prussian legal system. The emphasis on written law, professional judges, and formal procedures reflected Enlightenment ideals of rational governance, while also serving the practical need for predictable administration. Education policy under Frederick I showed both vision and limitation. While the king founded the University of Halle in 1694, which became a centre of pietist theology and Enlightenment philosophy, primary education for common people remained sporadic and underfunded. The idea that the state should provide universal education was discussed in intellectual circles, but not yet implemented as policy. Still, the foundation of institutions like Halle and the Academy of Sciences created intellectual infrastructure that would support later educational expansion. The role of women in Frederick's court represented both opportunity and constraint. Queen Sophie Charlotte's intellectual salon provided a space where talented women could participate in cultural and philosophical discussions. Some noble women exercised considerable influence through court positions or family connections. Yet legal and social restrictions remained severe, with women excluded from formal political power and most professions. The Queen's death in 1705 removed a powerful advocate for women's education and cultural participation, though her legacy inspired later generations. Frederick's foreign policy achievements extended beyond securing royal recognition. Through careful diplomacy, he acquired small territories that, while individually insignificant, demonstrated Prussia's growing ability to benefit from European conflicts. The acquisition of Lingen and Meurs in western Germany, though tiny, provided footholds in strategically important regions. More significantly, Frederick's participation in the Grand Alliance against France established Prussia as a reliable partner in European coalition politics. The cultural flowering during Frederick's reign, though expensive, established Prussia's credentials as a civilized European monarchy rather than just a military state. Italian opera companies performed in Berlin, French architects designed palaces, and Dutch painters decorated royal residences. The king established picture galleries and libraries that, while modest compared to older monarchies' collections, demonstrated cultural ambition. This cultural investment paid diplomatic dividends, as foreign courts began taking Prussia seriously as more than just a source of mercenary soldiers. The economic challenges of Frederick's reign revealed fundamental weaknesses in Prussia's position. The kingdom lacked the colonial empires that enriched Spain, Portugal, and increasingly Britain and France. It had no direct access to Atlantic trade routes that were revolutionizing European commerce. Its territories were scattered and difficult to defend, requiring expensive military forces that consumed resources needed for economic development. Frederick's solution, borrowing heavily and hoping for future prosperity, created debt problems that would plague his successor. Urban development during Frederick's reign concentrated heavily on Berlin, which grew from about 20,000 inhabitants to nearly 60,000. This rapid growth created both opportunities and problems. New industries emerged to serve the court and growing population, but infrastructure struggled to keep pace. Sanitation remained primitive. Fire was a constant danger in densely packed wooden buildings, and crime increased as rural migrants struggled to find legitimate employment. The contrast between magnificent royal palaces and squalid workers' quarters highlighted growing social tensions. The transformation of court ceremony and protocol under Frederick created distinctive Prussian traditions that balanced German customs with French sophistication. The Order of the Black Eagle, established in 1701 as Prussia's highest decoration, created an honorific system that bound nobles to the crown through prestige rather than just obligation. Court positions, from chamberlains to ladies-in-waiting, were carefully distributed to balance different regional and factional interests. These seemingly trivial matters of precedence and honour actually served important political functions in managing elite competition. The intellectual life of Frederick's Prussia showed increasing engagement with early Enlightenment ideas while maintaining strong religious influences. The University of Halle became a centre for pietism, a Protestant movement emphasising personal religious experience and social reform. Pietist emphasis on education and moral improvement aligned well with state needs for literate, disciplined subjects. At the same time, rationalist philosophy found adherents among educated elites who saw reason as the path to improved governance and social organisation. The development of Prussian bureaucracy during Frederick's reign established principles that would endure for centuries. Officials were increasingly selected based on education and examination, rather than just birth or purchase of office. Written procedures and formal hierarchies replaced informal personal relationships. Regular audits and inspections attempted to combat corruption and inefficiency. While implementation remained imperfect, the ideal of professional, impartial administration took root during this period. The relationship between state and economy during Frederick's reign showed growing governmental intervention in commercial affairs. Mercantilist policies aimed to maximise exports while minimising imports, accumulating precious metals that could finance military and court expenses. State monopolies, protective tariffs, and subsidies for favoured industries reflected belief that economic development required active governmental direction. These policies had mixed results, sometimes stimulating growth but also creating inefficiencies and corruption. The transformation of agriculture during Frederick's reign proceeded slowly but steadily. The introduction of new crops, particularly potatoes from the Americas, began changing dietary patterns and agricultural practices. Drainage projects in marshy areas created new farmland, though at enormous expense. The three-field system gradually gave way to more intensive cultivation methods in some regions. Yet most rural areas remained locked in traditional patterns, with peasants bound to noble estates and farming methods unchanged for centuries. The public health initiatives of Frederick's reign, though limited, showed growing governmental concern for population welfare. The establishment of hospitals in major cities, regulations governing medical practice, and attempts to combat epidemic diseases reflected both humanitarian impulses and practical recognition that healthy subjects were more productive. The Charité Hospital in Berlin, founded in 1710 in response to plague threats, became a model institution that combined patient care with medical education. Frederick's death on February 25, 1713, ended a reign that had transformed Brandenburg Prussia from an electorate into a kingdom. His achievements were real but expensive, creating a state with royal status and cultural pretensions, but also crushing debt and administrative inefficiency. His son and successor, Frederick William I, would react violently against his father's lavish spending and cultural aspirations, creating a very different model of Prussian kingship. Yet the fundamental transformation from duchy to kingdom, from peripheral territory to European power, had been achieved. The soldier king, Frederick William I. The contrast could not have been more stark when Frederick William I assumed the Prussian throne in 1713. Where his father had worn elaborate French wigs and silk stockings, the new king dressed in a simple military uniform. Where Frederick I had spent fortunes on court ceremonies and Italian operas, Frederick William dismissed most court positions and sent the musicians packing. Within days of his accession, the transformation was obvious to everyone. Prussia had acquired a very different sort of monarch, one who would earn the title Soldier King through his complete devotion to military strength and administrative efficiency. Frederick William's first act as king was to review the royal finances, and what he discovered appalled him. His father had left debts exceeding several years of state revenue. The court alone consumed nearly half the annual budget, while the army, which Frederick William considered the state's most essential institution, received inadequate funding. The new king's response was swift and dramatic. Court expenses were slashed by nearly 90%. Elaborate ceremonies were abolished. The royal household was reduced to essential personnel. Even the Queen's household faced severe cuts, causing considerable friction in the royal marriage. The king's personal habits set a new tone for Prussian governance. Frederick William rose at 4 a.m. in summer, 5 in winter, beginning each day with prayer and Bible reading. He dressed himself without servants, ate simple meals of beer soup and sausages, and spent his days reviewing military reports, inspecting troops, and personally examining government accounts. In the evenings he presided over the tobacco cabinet, informal gatherings where ministers and generals discussed state business, while smoking pipes and drinking beer. These sessions, filled with coarse jokes and military talk, replaced the elegant salons of his mother's era. The transformation of the Prussian military under Frederick William was nothing short of revolutionary. When he became king, Prussia had an army of about 38,000 men, respectable but not exceptional for a middle-sized European power. By his death in 1740, that force had grown to over 80,000, making it the fourth largest army in Europe, despite Prussia being only the 13th largest state in population. This wasn't just growth in numbers. It was a complete reimagining of what an army could be. The canton system, partially developed under previous rulers, was perfected during Frederick William's reign. Each regiment was assigned a specific district or canton from which it drew recruits. Every peasant family was required to provide sons for military service, creating a reserve system that could quickly mobilize trained soldiers in wartime. Noble estates were expected to provide officers, binding the aristocracy to military service as a defining characteristic of their class. This system created an army that was truly national rather than mercenary, with deep roots in Prussian society. Training under Frederick William reached levels of intensity previously unknown in European armies. Soldiers drilled constantly, practicing complex maneuvers until they could execute them perfectly, even under battlefield stress. The king personally wrote detailed regulations covering everything from uniform maintenance to battlefield tactics. The famous Prussian goose step, which required soldiers to march with legs raised high and kept straight, wasn't just ceremonial display. It was an exercise in discipline and coordination that translated into battlefield effectiveness. The king's obsession with tall soldiers became legendary across Europe. His Potsdam Giants, a special regiment of men all over 6 feet tall, included soldiers recruited, purchased, or even kidnapped from across Europe. Foreign rulers seeking Prussian favour would send tall men as diplomatic gifts. The king spent enormous sums acquiring these giants, sometimes paying more for a particularly tall recruit than a normal soldier would earn in a lifetime. While seemingly irrational, this obsession served practical purposes, demonstrating Prussian wealth and power while providing the king with personal pleasure in an otherwise austere existence. Administrative reform under Frederick William created the bureaucratic efficiency for which Prussia would become famous. The General Directory, established in 1723, centralized administration of finance, military affairs, and internal governance. This wasn't just organizational restructuring, it was a fundamental reimagining of how government should function. Officials were required to submit detailed reports on standardized forms. Every expenditure was documented and audited. Corruption, previously tolerated as normal practice, became a serious crime, punishable by dismissal or imprisonment. The king's approach to justice was harsh but consistent. He believed that swift, certain punishment deterred crime more effectively than severity alone. Death sentences required royal confirmation, and Frederick William personally reviewed capital cases, sometimes commuting sentences, but often confirming them with marginal notes like, "Let him hang." Yet he also insisted on procedural fairness, requiring proper evidence and forbidding torture except in extreme cases. This combination of harshness and legalism created a system that was cruel by modern standards, but relatively predictable and impartial for its time. Education policy under Frederick William reflected his practical orientation and religious convictions. In 1717, he decreed compulsory primary education for all children, though implementation remained incomplete due to lack of funds and resistance from parents who needed children's labour. The curriculum focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction, aiming to produce literate, numerate, and obedient subjects. The king saw education not as cultural enrichment, but as practical training for future soldiers, administrators, and productive workers. The king's religious beliefs profoundly influenced his governance. A devout Calvinist, Frederick William believed he ruled by divine appointment and would answer to God for his stewardship. This conviction drove his legendary work ethic and his concern for his subjects' moral welfare. He issued numerous edicts regulating public morality, banning activities like gambling, excessive drinking, and theatrical performances he considered immoral. Sunday observance was strictly enforced, with businesses closed, and church attendance strongly encouraged, if not quite mandatory. Economic policy under Frederick William combined mercantilism with practical innovation. The king understood that military power required economic strength, so he promoted domestic industries, particularly textiles and metallurgy, that could supply military needs. Immigration was encouraged, especially skilled craftsmen who could establish new industries. The king personally inspected factories and workshops, demanding quality production and efficient management. State monopolies on salt, tobacco, and other commodities generated revenue while protecting domestic producers. Agricultural improvement was another royal priority. Frederick William promoted cultivation of new crops, particularly potatoes, which could feed more people per acre than traditional grains. He ordered drainage of marshes to create new farmland, personally inspecting reclamation projects. The king's famous decree that peasants should plant potatoes or face punishment seemed tyrannical but reflected genuine concern for preventing famine. His agricultural policies increased food production and state revenues while maintaining the traditional social structure of noble estates and peasant obligations. The relationship between Frederick William and his son, the future Frederick the Great, was notoriously difficult and would shape Prussian history in unexpected ways. The king wanted his heir to be a soldier king like himself, focused on military matters and administrative efficiency. But Crown Prince Frederick preferred French literature, flute playing, and philosophical discussions. The conflict escalated dramatically when the 18-year-old prince attempted to flee to England in 1730. The king's response was brutal. He had Frederick arrested, forced him to watch the execution of his accomplice and friend Hans Hermann von Cutter and imprisoned him in the fortress of Kustrin. This traumatic episode revealed both the king's harsh character and his deep anxieties about Prussia's future. Frederick William had built his state through personal dedication and iron discipline, but he feared his heir would squander these achievements on cultural pursuits and military adventures. The reconciliation between father and son, gradual and never complete, came through Frederick's grudging acceptance of military duties and administrative responsibilities. The Crown Prince learned to hide his cultural interests while mastering the military and governmental skills his father demanded. The transformation of Berlin under Frederick William reflected his practical priorities. Unlike his father's emphasis on palaces and ceremonial spaces, Frederick William focused on functional improvements. Barracks were built to house soldiers, reducing the burden on civilians who had been required to quarter troops. New workshops and manufactories were established to supply military needs and provide employment. The city walls were strengthened and expanded. Berlin grew from about 60,000 to nearly 100,000 inhabitants, becoming a military and administrative centre rather than a cultural capital. The Prussian nobility's relationship with Frederick William was complex and sometimes tense. The king demanded absolute obedience and military service from nobles, but also protected their privileges and economic interests. Junker officers dominated the military hierarchy, receiving preference in promotions and appointments. Noble estates remained exempt from many taxes and retained judicial authority over peasants. This alliance between crown and nobility, based on mutual benefit rather than affection, created a distinctive Prussian social structure that combined absolutist monarchy with aristocratic privilege. The role of women during Frederick William's reign was severely constrained even by contemporary standards. The king believed women should focus exclusively on household management and child rearing. Queen Sophie Dorothea, daughter of King George I of Britain, found her influence limited to informal intercession for courtiers in trouble. The dismissal of most court positions eliminated opportunities for noble women to exercise even indirect political influence. Educational opportunities for girls were minimal, focusing on basic literacy and domestic skills. This marginalization of women would have long-lasting effects on Prussian society. Foreign policy under Frederick William was cautiously defensive despite his military build-up. The king understood that Prussia, surrounded by larger powers, could not afford military adventures. He maintained the army at great expense, not for conquest, but for deterrence and diplomatic leverage. When European conflicts arose, Frederick William usually sold Prussian military support to the highest bidder, gaining subsidies that helped finance his domestic programs. This pragmatic approach avoided costly wars while building resources for future expansion. The development of Prussian bureaucracy under Frederick William created a distinctive administrative culture. Officials were expected to be honest, efficient, and completely devoted to state service. The king personally examined candidates for important positions, testing their knowledge and character. Promotion was based on merit rather than birth or purchase, though nobles still received preference for higher positions. Regular inspections and audits detected corruption or incompetence. This system created a bureaucracy that was rigid and sometimes harsh but generally honest and effective. The king's daily routine became legendary for its rigid precision. He scheduled every hour, allocating specific times for different governmental departments, military inspections, and even meals. Ministers knew exactly when they could see the king and how long their audiences would last. This systematic approach to time management, unusual for monarchs of the era, reflected Frederick William's belief that royal service required constant attention and that wasting time was both sinful and harmful to the state. Public works projects under Frederick William focused on practical improvements rather than monuments to royal glory. Roads were improved to facilitate troop movements and commercial transport. Canals were dug to connect rivers and drain swamps. Bridges were built or reinforced to handle military traffic. These projects employed thousands of workers and stimulated economic development while serving strategic purposes. The king personally inspected major projects, demanding quality construction and efficient use of resources. The cultural life of Prussia under Frederick William suffered from royal disapproval and financial constraints. The king closed the royal opera, dismissed court musicians, and showed no interest in supporting artists or writers. The Academy of Sciences, founded by his father, survived but received minimal funding. Universities focused on practical subjects like law, theology, and medicine rather than humanities. This cultural austerity created a reputation for Prussian Philistinism that would persist despite later cultural achievements. The legal reforms of Frederick William's reign emphasized uniformity and severity. The king wanted laws that were clear, consistently applied, and harsh enough to deter crime. New legal codes standardized punishments for specific crimes, reducing judicial discretion. The death penalty was prescribed for numerous offences, from murder to desertion to some forms of theft. Yet the king also insisted on proper procedures, requiring written records of all proceedings and allowing appeals to higher courts. This combination of harshness and legalism created a system that was cruel but predictable. The king's health declined in his final years, plagued by gout, dropsy, and what modern medicine might diagnose as metabolic disorders. Yet he continued his rigid routine, reviewing documents from his sickbed and receiving ministers even when in severe pain. His death on May 31st, 1740 ended a reign that had transformed Prussia from a debt-ridden kingdom with pretensions beyond its means into a militarily powerful state with sound finances and efficient administration. Frederick William's legacy was complex and contradictory. His harsh discipline and cultural Philistinism made him unpopular among educated elites who compared Prussia unfavourably to more refined courts. Yet his administrative reforms, military build-up, and financial prudence created the foundation for Prussian greatness. His son Frederick, despite their troubled relationship, would use the army and resources his father accumulated to transform Prussia into a major European power. The soldier king had created the instruments of power. His successor would demonstrate how to use them. Frederick the Great's enlightened reign. The young man who ascended the Prussian throne on May 31st, 1740, seemed everything his father was not. Frederick II, soon to be known as Frederick the Great, spoke French better than German, composed flute concertos, corresponded with Voltaire, and had spent years secretly reading philosophy and poetry while pretending to care about military drills. Observers across Europe expected this cultured prince to transform Prussia into a salon for enlightened discussion. They would be shocked to discover that beneath the philosopher's wit lay strategic genius, an iron determination that would make Prussia a great power. Frederick's first acts as king suggested radical change was coming. He abolished torture in criminal proceedings, proclaimed religious tolerance, and recalled philosophers and artists his father had banished. He founded the Berlin Opera and invited French intellectuals to his court. He ordered that the Academy of Sciences, neglected under his father, be revitalized and properly funded. Yet even as he pursued these cultural initiatives, Frederick was secretly preparing for war, studying maps of neighbouring territories and corresponding with generals about military preparations. The opportunity Frederick sought came within months of his accession. When Emperor Charles VI died in October 1740, leaving his daughter Maria Theresa as heir to the vast Habsburg domains, Frederick saw weakness he could exploit. Despite Prussia having signed agreements recognizing Maria Theresa's succession, Frederick claimed obsolete rights to Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg province bordering Brandenburg. On December 16, 1740, without declaration of war, Prussian troops marched into Silesia, beginning conflicts that would consume much of Frederick's reign. The invasion of Silesia shocked Europe not just for its boldness, but for its calculated cynicism. Frederick himself later admitted he acted from ambition, opportunity, and desire for glory. He wrote to his minister, "I am young, I have a good army, a full treasury, and I want to see my name in the gazettes." This honesty about power politics, stripped of religious or legal justification, marked a new kind of warfare where state interest superseded traditional obligations. The Battle of Mollwitz on April 10, 1741, nearly ended Frederick's career before it properly began. The young king, inexperienced in actual combat, fled the battlefield when Austrian cavalry broke through Prussian lines. Yet the disciplined Prussian infantry, trained to perfection by Frederick William, stood firm and won the day through superior firepower and drill. Frederick learned from this humiliation, never again leaving a battlefield early, and dedicating himself to mastering military science with the same intensity he had once applied to poetry. The First Silesian War established patterns that would characterize Frederick's military strategy throughout his reign. He emphasized speed and concentration of force, striking enemies before they could fully mobilize. Prussian armies marched faster and maneuvered more precisely than their opponents, turning the endless drill of peacetime into battlefield advantage. Frederick personally commanded major battles, sharing dangers with common soldiers and earning their devotion through visible courage and concern for their welfare. The Peace of 1742 gave Prussia most of Silesia, but Frederick knew this was only a temporary respite. He used the interlude to strengthen his army, improve administration, and prepare for inevitable renewed conflict. The Second Silesian War from 1744 to 1745 saw Frederick demonstrate growing military sophistication, winning brilliant victories at Hohenfriedberg and Soor through innovative tactics and perfect timing. Yet these wars also revealed Prussia's fundamental vulnerability, surrounded by hostile powers that could potentially combine to crush the upstart kingdom. Frederick's domestic policies during the 1740s and 1750s reflected Enlightenment ideals filtered through practical necessity. He maintained his father's efficient bureaucracy while adding intellectual sophistication. Legal reform was a particular priority, with Frederick personally involved in creating new law codes that balanced humanitarian concerns with state authority. Prohibition of torture was maintained and extended. Judges received better training and higher salaries to reduce corruption. Yet Frederick also maintained harsh punishments for crimes against state authority and showed little sympathy for democratic ideas. The king's religious policy demonstrated both principled tolerance and cynical calculation. His famous declaration that everyone must be saved in their own fashion granted unprecedented religious freedom. Catholics, Jews, and various Protestant sects could worship freely, build churches, and participate in economic life. Yet this tolerance had limits. Jews faced special taxes and restrictions on residence. Catholics were excluded from higher government positions. Religious freedom was granted not from belief in individual rights, but because persecution wasted resources and drove away productive subjects. Economic development under Frederick combined mercantilist tradition with innovative approaches. The king promoted domestic industries through subsidies, monopolies, and protective tariffs. The silk industry, virtually non-existent when Frederick became king, employed thousands by the 1750s. New settlements were established in underpopulated regions, with immigrants receiving land, tools, and tax exemptions. The draining of the Oder marshes created vast new agricultural lands. These projects required enormous investment, but Frederick understood that economic strength underpinned military power. The 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, nearly destroyed everything Frederick had built. Prussia faced a coalition, including Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and most of the Holy Roman Empire. The odds seemed impossible, with enemies attacking from every direction. Frederick later called this period the hardest test of his life, when he carried poison to avoid capture and considered suicide when defeat seemed certain. Yet through brilliant generalship, iron determination, and crucial British financial support, Prussia survived. The battles of the 7 Years' War became legendary demonstrations of Prussian military excellence. At Rossbach in 1757, Frederick's army of 22,000 defeated a Franco-imperial force of 42,000 through superior manoeuvre and devastating artillery fire. At Leuthen the same year, Frederick's oblique attack shattered an Austrian army twice his size. Yet there were also terrible defeats. At Kunersdorf in 1759, Russian and Austrian forces nearly annihilated the Prussian army, with Frederick himself barely escaping capture. The war's toll on Prussia was catastrophic. Entire provinces were devastated, with some regions losing half their population to war, disease, and flight. Berlin was occupied and plundered by Russian troops. The economy collapsed as trade stopped and agriculture was destroyed. Frederick aged visibly, his hair turning white and his face becoming gaunt. He wrote desperate letters considering abdication and partition of his kingdom. Yet he persevered, fighting on when others would have surrendered. The miracle that saved Prussia came from an unexpected source. When Empress Elizabeth of Russia died in January 1762, her successor Peter III, who idolized Frederick, immediately switched sides. This miracle of the House of Brandenburg, as Frederick called it, broke the coalition and allowed Prussia to escape with Silesia intact. The Treaty of Hubertusburg in 1763 confirmed Prussian possession of Silesia, but at a terrible cost. Prussia had survived but was exhausted, depopulated, and economically ruined. Frederick's post-war reconstruction efforts showed administrative genius equal to his military talents. He toured devastated provinces, personally assessing damage and organising relief efforts. State granaries were opened to prevent famine. Seed grain was distributed to farmers who had lost everything. Tax exemptions were granted to the worst-hit regions. Foreign colonists were recruited to repopulate empty lands. Within a decade, most visible war damage had been repaired, though demographic and psychological scars remained. The partition of Poland in 1772 marked Frederick's return to expansionist politics, though in a different form than his youthful aggression. When Russia and Austria moved to dismember Poland, Frederick joined to prevent his rivals from gaining too much advantage. Prussia acquired West Prussia, finally connecting Brandenburg with East Prussia and gaining valuable agricultural lands and the important port of Danzig. Frederick justified this seizure with cynical wit, saying she wept but she took about Maria Theresa's moral qualms while participating in the partition. Cultural life during Frederick's reign reflected the king's complex personality and evolving priorities. The early enthusiasm for French culture gradually gave way to support for German letters and arts. The Berlin Academy became a major intellectual centre, though Frederick's preference for French over German scholars caused resentment. The king's own writings, including historical works, poetry, and philosophical treatises, showed genuine intellectual engagement despite their mediocre literary quality. His correspondence with Voltaire and other philosophers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Enlightenment ideas even when he rejected their political implications. The relationship between Frederick and Voltaire deserves special attention as it illuminated both men's characters and the tension between intellectual ideals and political reality. Voltaire arrived at Frederick's court in 1750, expecting to find a philosopher king implementing Enlightenment principles. Instead, he found an autocrat who used enlightened rhetoric while maintaining absolute power. Their friendship turned to bitter enmity, with Voltaire fleeing Prussia in 1753 after conflicts over money, jealousy, and fundamental differences about power and freedom. Frederick's approach to justice evolved throughout his reign, becoming more personally interventionist in later years. The king reviewed legal cases himself, sometimes overturning judicial decisions he considered unjust. The famous Miller-Arnold case of 1779, where Frederick imprisoned judges who had ruled against a poor miller in favour of a nobleman, showed the king's conception of himself as protector of common subjects against aristocratic oppression. Yet this intervention also undermined judicial independence and legal predictability. Agricultural reform under Frederick aimed to increase productivity while maintaining social stability. The king promoted new crops, particularly potatoes and turnips, sometimes forcing reluctant peasants to adopt them. He established model farms to demonstrate improved techniques. Drainage projects continued throughout his reign, creating thousands of acres of new farmland. Yet Frederick also maintained the traditional system of noble estates and peasant obligations, believing social hierarchy necessary for order. The Prussian army under Frederick evolved into Europe's most professional military force. The king wrote extensive military treatises analysing tactics, strategy, and logistics. He established military academies to train officers in mathematics, engineering, and military science. The army became a parallel society with its own laws, customs, and values. Soldiers served long terms, often decades, creating professional warriors rather than temporary conscripts. This military excellence came at enormous cost, consuming over half the state budget even in peacetime. Frederick's personal life remained austere despite his cultural interests. He rose early, worked long hours on state business, and maintained simple habits in food and dress. His marriage to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevan was purely political. They lived apart after his accession and had no children. Frederick's sexuality has been debated by historians, with some suggesting homosexual orientation, though evidence remains inconclusive. What seems clear is that Frederick subordinated personal relationships to state duties. Educational reform under Frederick expanded on his father's foundations, while adding intellectual depth. New schools were established, teacher training was improved, and curricula were expanded beyond basic literacy. The king founded teacher seminaries to professionalize education. He established specialized schools for mining, forestry, and other technical subjects. Yet education remained limited for most subjects, with rural schools often operating only in winter when agricultural labor wasn't needed. The role of the nobility under Frederick showed both continuity and change. The king maintained the Junkers' dominance of military and administrative positions, believing aristocratic leadership essential for state stability. Yet he also demanded competence and service, dismissing incompetent nobles and promoting talented commoners in exceptional cases. The nobility's privileges were preserved but came with increased obligations for military service and administrative duty. Frederick's economic policies in his later reign showed growing sophistication and state intervention. The king established state banks to provide credit for economic development. He created monopolies in coffee, tobacco, and other commodities to generate revenue. Manufacturing was promoted through subsidies and protective tariffs. The porcelain factory at Berlin, established to compete with Meissen and Sèvres, became a source of prestige and profit. These policies created growth, but also inefficiencies and corruption that would plague Prussia after Frederick's death. The king's approach to religious and ethnic minorities remained pragmatically tolerant within limits. Jews were allowed to engage in commerce and finance but faced special taxes and residential restrictions. Catholics could worship freely but were excluded from state service. French Huguenots continued to receive favourable treatment as valuable economic contributors. This selective tolerance reflected Frederick's view that diversity was acceptable when it served state interests, but dangerous when it threatened unity. The transformation of Berlin during Frederick's reign created a capital worthy of a great power. New palaces, including the magnificent Sanssouci at Potsdam, showcased royal taste and power. The Forum Fridericianum, with its opera house, library and academy, created a cultural centre rivaling other European capitals. Wide boulevards, impressive public buildings, and regulated architectural styles gave Berlin a coherent, monumental character. The city's population grew to nearly 200,000, making it one of Europe's major urban centres. Frederick's final years were marked by increasing isolation and cynicism. The king, never gregarious, became almost reclusive, spending most time at Sanssouci with his dogs and books. He continued working on state business with undiminished energy, but showed growing pessimism about human nature and social progress. His last major political act, forming the League of Princes in 1785 to prevent Austrian expansion in Germany, showed he retained strategic vision even in old age. The king's death on August 17, 1786, ended a reign that had transformed Prussia from a middle-ranking kingdom into a great power. Frederick left a state with double territory, a formidable army, efficient administration, and considerable cultural achievements. Yet he also left problems that would challenge his successors. The army consumed unsustainable resources, the nobility's privileges blocked social reform, and the personal nature of Frederick's rule left unclear precedents for constitutional development. The Napoleonic Wars and Prussian reform. The Prussia that Frederick the Great left behind in 1786 seemed invincibly strong, its army victorious in every major conflict, its administration the envy of Europe, its treasury full despite recent wars. Yet within 2 decades this mighty kingdom would suffer the most catastrophic defeat in its history, its army shattered, its capital occupied, its very existence hanging by a thread. The story of Prussia during the Napoleonic era is one of hubris leading to catastrophe, followed by remarkable regeneration through fundamental reform. Frederick William II, who succeeded his uncle Frederick the Great, possessed neither military genius nor administrative talent. Where Frederick had lived simply and worked constantly, Frederick William indulged in pleasures and left governance to ministers. He maintained 2 official mistresses, spent lavishly on court entertainment, and showed more interest in mystical religious societies than military preparedness. Yet initially, Prussia's institutional strength compensated for royal weakness, and the kingdom even expanded through the second and third partitions of Poland in 1793 and 1795. These Polish partitions brought Prussia vast new territories, but also dangerous complications. The annexed lands included large Polish populations with their own language, culture, and national consciousness. Catholic Poles resented Protestant Prussian rule, creating internal tensions that would persist for generations. Moreover, the destruction of Poland removed a buffer between Prussia and Russia, bringing these 2 powers into direct contact with potentially explosive consequences. The French Revolution's outbreak in 1789 initially seemed distant from Prussian concerns, but as revolutionary ideas spread and French armies marched across Europe, Prussia could not remain aloof. Frederick William II joined Austria in declaring war on revolutionary France in 1792, expecting easy victory over what seemed like a chaotic republic. The Prussian army that marched into France carried the reputation earned under Frederick the Great, but the reality had changed dramatically. Officers were aging veterans of Frederick's wars, clinging to outdated tactics. Common soldiers, recruited through the canton system, served reluctantly for decades with little motivation beyond avoiding punishment. The Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792, shattered Prussian illusions of easy victory. The vaunted Prussian infantry, advancing in perfect linear formation as they had under Frederick, met devastating artillery fire from French revolutionary forces fighting with patriotic fervour. The Prussians retreated not from catastrophic defeat, but from recognition that war had changed. The French conscript armies, motivated by revolutionary ideals and fighting in flexible formations, represented a new kind of warfare that Prussian traditional methods could not easily counter. The subsequent years saw Prussia wavering between war and peace with France, its policy driven more by immediate advantage than consistent principle. The Peace of Basel in 1795 took Prussia out of the war, allowing it to focus on digesting Polish territories, while France and Austria continued fighting. This neutrality brought temporary prosperity, but also strategic isolation. While French military power grew under the Directory and then Napoleon Bonaparte, Prussia remained static, its army unreformed, its leadership complacent. Frederick William III, who became king in 1797, was well-intentioned but indecisive, a fatal flaw in an era demanding bold leadership. He recognized problems in Prussian administration and military organization, but feared that reform might undermine the traditional order that sustained the monarchy. His queen, Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, possessed the charm and determination her husband lacked, becoming a symbol of Prussian resistance to French domination. Yet neither royal personality nor patriotic sentiment could substitute for systematic reform. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte transformed European politics in ways Prussia struggled to comprehend. This Corsican artillery officer, who became Emperor of France, represented everything Prussian tradition opposed: a commoner ruling through merit rather than birth, an innovator overthrowing established order, a charismatic leader inspiring mass enthusiasm rather than disciplined obedience. Napoleon's military genius, combining rapid movement, concentrated artillery, and flexible tactics, made traditional Prussian methods obsolete. Prussia maintained neutrality as Napoleon defeated Austria and Russia, hoping to preserve its position through diplomacy rather than war. This policy might have worked with traditional monarchs, who respected balance of power, but Napoleon recognized no limits to his ambition. He systematically reorganized Germany, abolishing hundreds of small states and creating new kingdoms loyal to France. The Holy Roman Empire, which had provided the framework for German politics for 1,000 years, was dissolved in 1806, leaving Prussia isolated and vulnerable. The creation of the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, uniting most German states under French protection, finally forced Prussia to act. Encouraged by Queen Louise and war party ministers, Frederick William III issued an ultimatum to Napoleon, demanding French withdrawal from Germany. Napoleon's response was swift and devastating. The French army, veterans of victories across Europe, marched against Prussia with overwhelming force and confidence. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806, destroyed the Prussian army in a single day. At Jena, Napoleon himself crushed the main Prussian force under Prince Hohenlohe, while at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout's single corps defeated the supposedly superior Prussian army, commanded by the Duke of Brunswick and the king himself. The Prussian forces, fighting in rigid linear formations, unchanged since Frederick the Great's time, were outmaneuvered and outfought by flexible French columns supported by massed artillery. The collapse after Jena Auerstedt was total and humiliating. Prussian fortresses surrendered without fighting. The vaunted army dissolved as soldiers deserted en masse. Napoleon entered Berlin on October 27, 1806, visiting Frederick the Great's tomb and taking his sword and decorations as trophies. Within weeks, Prussia lost almost all territory west of the Elbe River. Only East Prussia remained unoccupied, and that tenuously. The Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807 reduced Prussia to a rump state. Half its territory was stripped away, formed into new French satellite states, or given to French allies. The army was limited to 42,000 men. An enormous indemnity, impossible to pay, was imposed, with French troops occupying key fortresses until payment was complete. Prussia survived only because Napoleon wanted a buffer between his empire and Russia, and because Tsar Alexander, charmed by Napoleon at their famous meeting on a raft in the Niemen River, did not insist on Prussia's complete destruction. The humiliation of Tilsit paradoxically saved Prussia by forcing fundamental reforms that conservative forces had previously blocked. A remarkable group of reformers emerged, understanding that Prussia could only survive through transformation. Baron Heinrich von Stein, appointed chief minister in 1807, began revolutionary changes despite serving a conservative monarchy. Karl August von Hardenberg, who succeeded Stein, continued reforms while navigating treacherous diplomatic waters. Generals Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau rebuilt the military on new principles. Wilhelm von Humboldt revolutionized education. These men, different in background and temperament, shared a vision of regenerated Prussia that could compete in the modern world. The Stein-Hardenberg reforms transformed Prussian society more profoundly than any changes since the Great Elector's time. The October Edict of 1807 abolished serfdom, declaring that after St. Martin's Day 1810 there shall be only free people. Peasants could now own land, move freely, and choose their occupations. The nobility lost their monopoly on land ownership, but gained freedom to engage in commerce and industry. These changes, implemented gradually and with many compromises, began transforming Prussia from a feudal state into a modern society. Urban reform was equally revolutionary. The Municipal Ordinance of 1808 granted cities self-government through elected councils. Citizens who met property qualifications could vote and hold office, regardless of birth. This limited democracy was far from universal suffrage, but it introduced representative principles into Prussian governance. Cities gained control over their finances, police, and education, creating laboratories for administrative innovation. Military reform under Scharnhorst and Gneisenau addressed both practical necessity and philosophical principle. With the army limited by treaty to 42,000 men, the reformers created the Krumper system, rapidly training recruits, then releasing them to civilian life while maintaining a reserve that could be mobilized in war. This circumvented treaty restrictions while creating a citizen army rather than a professional military caste. Officer positions were open to commoners based on education and merit, though nobles still predominated. Military punishment was humanized, with flogging restricted and soldiers treated as citizens in uniform, rather than military slaves. Educational reform under Humboldt aimed to create citizens capable of independent thought rather than just obedient subjects. The University of Berlin, founded in 1810, emphasized research and academic freedom, becoming a model for universities worldwide. Gymnasiums provided classical education preparing students for university, while Realschulen offered practical training for commercial and technical careers. Primary education was expanded and improved, with better trained teachers and broader curricula. These reforms created an educated population that would drive Prussian economic and cultural development. Economic reforms swept away medieval restrictions on commerce and industry. The guild system, which had controlled crafts for centuries, was abolished, allowing anyone to practice any trade. Internal tariffs were eliminated, creating a unified Prussian market. Jews received civil rights and could engage in most occupations, though some restrictions remained. These changes unleashed entrepreneurial energy, beginning Prussia's transformation from agricultural state to industrial power. The Reform era also saw cultural and intellectual flowering despite, or perhaps because of, political oppression. German nationalism, previously an intellectual abstraction, became a powerful force as people united against French domination. The philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte delivered his Addresses to the German Nation in French-occupied Berlin, calling for spiritual regeneration through education and moral renewal. The Brothers Grimm collected folk tales that celebrated German cultural traditions. Ernst Moritz Arndt and Theodor Körner wrote patriotic poetry that inspired resistance to Napoleon. Women played important roles in this national awakening, though their contributions were often overlooked. Queen Louise became a martyr figure after her death in 1810, symbolizing Prussian suffering and determination. Women organized charitable societies to support war victims and maintain national spirit during occupation. Some, like the writer Bettina von Arnim, participated in intellectual movements that shaped German nationalism. Though women gained no political rights during the Reform era, their involvement in patriotic activities challenged traditional gender boundaries. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to exclude British trade from Europe, created both hardship and opportunity for Prussia. Traditional trade routes were disrupted, causing economic distress. But isolation from British competition also protected nascent Prussian industries. Sugar beet cultivation expanded to replace Caribbean cane sugar. Textile production grew to substitute for British imports. These developments, initially driven by necessity, laid foundations for later industrial growth. Prussian resistance to Napoleon remained largely passive until 1812, when the Emperor's disastrous invasion of Russia changed everything. As the Grande Armée retreated through Prussia in winter 1812–1813, its weakness became apparent. General Ludwig Yorck von Wartenberg, commanding Prussian auxiliary troops, forced to support Napoleon, took the momentous decision to sign the Convention of Tauroggen with Russia on December 30th, 1812, declaring his forces neutral. This act of insubordination, initially disavowed by King Frederick William III, sparked popular uprising against French occupation. The Wars of Liberation from 1813 to 1815 saw Prussia transformed from defeated victim to victorious power. The king, pressured by popular sentiment and his generals, finally declared war on France in March 1813. The Landwehr, a citizen militia created by the reforms, mobilized hundreds of thousands of men who fought with patriotic enthusiasm unknown in Frederick the Great's professional army. Women contributed by organizing supplies, nursing wounded, and maintaining home front morale. The entire nation participated in what became a people's war. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of the Nations, saw Prussia join with Austria, Russia, and Sweden to inflict decisive defeat on Napoleon. Prussian forces, reformed and motivated, fought with distinction. The sight of Prussian troops marching into Paris in 1814 after Napoleon's first abdication symbolically reversed the humiliation of 1806. At Waterloo in 1815, Blücher's Prussian army, arrived at the crucial moment to ensure Napoleon's final defeat, sharing victory with Wellington's British forces. The Congress of Vienna in 1814–1815 rewarded Prussia with significant territorial gains, though not everything reformers hoped. Prussia received the Rhineland and Westphalia in western Germany, rich territories that would become industrial powerhouses. Saxony was partitioned, with Prussia gaining the northern portion. These acquisitions made Prussia a truly German power, with territories stretching from the Rhine to the Niemen, though still divided into eastern and western portions separated by other German states. The Reform era's legacy was complex and contested. Conservatives, strengthened by victory over Napoleon, sought to reverse changes that threatened traditional order. The Carlsbad decrees of 1819 suppressed liberal and nationalist movements, censored publications, and restricted universities. Many reformers were dismissed or marginalized. Yet fundamental changes could not be entirely reversed. Serfdom remained abolished, cities retained self-government, and educational reforms continued expanding. The tension between reform and reaction would characterize Prussian politics for decades. The German Confederation era. The years following Napoleon's defeat in 1815 brought Prussia into a new political arrangement that would define German politics for half a century. The German Confederation, established at the Congress of Vienna, replaced the defunct Holy Roman Empire with a loose association of 39 sovereign states. Prussia, as one of two great powers within this confederation, alongside Austria, found itself in an awkward position, both leader and subordinate, modernizing force and conservative monarchy, German patriot and particular state defending its own interests. The architect of this new order was Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich, who viewed the Confederation as a means to maintain Austrian dominance in Germany while preventing either revolution or Prussian expansion. The Confederation's parliament, the Federal Diet meeting in Frankfurt, required unanimity for major decisions, ensuring paralysis on controversial issues. This system frustrated Prussian ambitions, but also provided stability after decades of war. For many Germans exhausted by conflict, this conservative peace seemed preferable to continued upheaval. Frederick William III, still King of Prussia, had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars with enhanced prestige but unchanged conservative instincts. The reforms that had saved Prussia were gradually curtailed once the French threat receded. The promise of a constitution, made during the desperate days of 1813, was quietly forgotten. The Landwehr, symbol of citizen participation in defence, was subordinated to the regular army. Noble privileges, partially curtailed during Reform era, were gradually restored. The king preferred gradual administrative improvement to fundamental political change. Yet Prussia could not entirely return to pre-Napoleonic conditions. The new Rhineland territories brought different traditions and expectations. The Rhineland's Code Napoleon, the French legal system introduced during occupation, remained in force because it was more modern and efficient than traditional Prussian law. Rhineland merchants and industrialists, accustomed to economic freedom, resisted Prussian bureaucratic control. Catholics, the majority in Western territories, viewed Protestant Prussian rule with suspicion. These tensions forced Prussian administrators to be more flexible and accommodating than they might have preferred. The economic transformation of Prussia accelerated despite political conservatism. The acquisition of the Rhineland brought coal deposits that would fuel industrialization. The Ruhr Valley, still largely agricultural in 1815, began its transformation into Europe's greatest industrial region. Steam engines appeared in mines and factories. Railways, first introduced in the 1830s, began connecting dispersed Prussian territories. This economic modernization created new social forces, industrial workers, entrepreneurial capitalists, educated professionals that would eventually challenge traditional order. The Zollverein, or customs union, initiated by Prussia in 1834, became the kingdom's most successful tool for extending influence throughout Germany. By eliminating tariffs between member states while maintaining common external tariffs, the Zollverein created a unified German market under Prussian leadership. Initially including only a few small states, it gradually expanded to include most of Germany except Austria. This economic integration preceded and prepared political unification, demonstrating Prussian leadership through practical benefits rather than military force. The Zollverein's success reflected careful Prussian planning and administration. Uniform weights, measures, and currencies were gradually introduced. Roads were improved to facilitate trade. Technical education was promoted to support industrial development. Prussia's efficient bureaucracy managed the complex system of revenue sharing and trade regulation. Other German states, initially suspicious of Prussian dominance, found membership too economically beneficial to refuse. Austria, with its diverse non-German territories and different economic interests, remained excluded, deepening the division between the two German great powers. Cultural and intellectual life during the Confederation era showed both creativity and repression. The Romantic movement flourished, celebrating German history, folklore, and landscape. Caspar David Friedrich painted misty forests and ruined abbeys that evoked spiritual longing. The brothers Grimm published their fairy tale collections, creating a shared German cultural heritage. Yet political expression faced severe restrictions. The Karlsbad Decrees of 1819, pressed by Metternich and accepted by Prussia, imposed censorship, university surveillance, and prohibition of political organizations. The Burschenschaften, student fraternities promoting German nationalism and liberal ideas, became targets of particular repression. Their black-red-gold colours, adopted from uniforms worn by Lützow's Free Corps during the Wars of Liberation, symbolized hopes for unified, constitutional Germany. When a theology student associated with the Burschenschaften assassinated conservative playwright August von Kotzebue in 1819, authorities used this as pretext for comprehensive crackdown. Universities were placed under government supervision, professors were dismissed for political views, and students were arrested for possessing prohibited literature. Religion remained a contentious issue in post-Napoleonic Prussia. The king's attempt to unite Lutheran and Reformed churches into a single Prussian union created lasting controversy. Many Lutherans resisted, viewing the union as theological compromise and state interference. Old Lutherans who refused to join faced persecution, with some emigrating to America. Meanwhile, tensions with Catholic subjects intensified, particularly over mixed marriages and church control of education. These religious conflicts revealed deeper tensions about identity, authority, and modernization in Prussian society. The reign of Frederick William IV, beginning in 1840, brought hopes for liberalization that were partially fulfilled, then dramatically disappointed. The new king, romantic and artistic, initially relaxed censorship, amnestied political prisoners, and promised constitutional reform. He patronized art and architecture, completing Cologne Cathedral as a symbol of German unity. Yet his vision was medieval rather than modern, imagining himself as a patriarchal Christian ruler rather than a constitutional monarch. His mental instability, which worsened over time, made consistent policy impossible. The 1840s saw growing pressure for political reform throughout Germany. The educated middle class, enriched by industrialization, demanded participation in governance. Workers concentrated in growing cities began organizing despite legal prohibitions. Liberal ideas spread through newspapers, social clubs, and informal networks despite censorship. Even conservative nobles recognized that some accommodation with modern forces was necessary. The question was whether reform would come gradually from above or explosively from below. The Revolution of 1848 provided a dramatic answer. Beginning with uprising in Paris in February, revolutionary fever spread across Europe. In Berlin, crowds gathered demanding constitution, free press, and German unity. When troops fired on demonstrators, on March 18th, killing hundreds, barricades appeared throughout the city. Frederick William IV, shocked by violence and temporarily sympathetic to reform, ordered troops withdrawn and promised a constitution. He even wore the black, red, gold cockade and honoured fallen revolutionaries, seeming to embrace the liberal cause. The Frankfurt Parliament, which convened in May 1848, represented the high point of liberal nationalist hopes. Elected by universal male suffrage, it included Germany's intellectual elite: professors, lawyers, writers, and professionals. They debated fundamental questions about German identity and governance. Should unified Germany include Austria, with its non-German territories? Should it be a centralized state or a federation? Should it have a democratic republic or a constitutional monarchy? These debates, conducted with remarkable erudition and idealism, revealed both the potential and limitations of liberal nationalism. Prussia's role in the Frankfurt Parliament was ambiguous and ultimately decisive. Prussian delegates were divided between those supporting Greater German unity and those defending Prussian particular interests. The Prussian government, recovering from initial revolutionary shock, gradually reasserted control. The army, always loyal to the crown, suppressed radical movements. The liberal ministry appointed during revolutionary crisis was replaced by conservatives. By autumn 1848, counter-revolution was advancing throughout Germany. The Frankfurt Parliament's offer of the German imperial crown to Frederick William IV in April 1849 represented both triumph and tragedy. The delegates, recognizing that unity required Prussian power, offered to make the Prussian king German emperor. But Frederick William, calling it a crown from the gutter, refused to accept sovereignty from a revolutionary assembly. He would only accept a crown offered by fellow princes, not granted by popular sovereignty. This refusal effectively ended the Frankfurt Parliament and the revolutionary hope for liberal unification. The constitution imposed by Frederick William IV in 1850 represented conservative compromise with modern forces. It created a parliament with two houses, an appointed upper house dominated by nobles, and an elected lower house chosen through a three-class voting system that gave wealthy voters disproportionate influence. The king retained control over the military and foreign policy. Ministers were responsible to the crown, not parliament. This system preserved authoritarian monarchy while allowing limited political participation, satisfying neither liberals nor reactionaries. The punctation of Olmütz in 1850 marked Prussia's diplomatic humiliation and Austria's temporary triumph. Prussia had attempted to create a smaller German union, excluding Austria, but when Austria threatened war, backed by Russia, Prussia capitulated. The German Confederation was restored under Austrian presidency. Prussia seemed to have lost the struggle for German leadership, yet this defeat taught Prussian leaders, particularly the rising diplomat Otto von Bismarck, that German unification required military strength, diplomatic isolation of Austria, and careful manipulation of nationalist sentiment. Economic development during the Confederation era transformed Prussian society more than political events. Railway construction boomed, connecting all major cities by 1850. The Borsig locomotive works in Berlin became Europe's largest after those in Britain. Krupp steelworks in Essen began producing the artillery that would later ensure Prussian military superiority. Chemical industries emerged, with German scientists leading in new synthetic processes. This industrialization created wealth, but also social problems, urban overcrowding, worker exploitation, and environmental degradation. The social question became increasingly urgent as industrialization accelerated. Workers laboured 12 to 16 hours daily in dangerous conditions for wages that barely ensured survival. Child labour was common despite sporadic attempts at regulation. Housing in industrial cities was overcrowded and unsanitary. Early socialist ideas began spreading among workers, though organisation remained illegal. The Communist Manifesto, published by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848, though little noticed at the time, would later inspire revolutionary movements. Education expansion continued despite political reaction. Primary schooling became nearly universal, making Prussia one of Europe's most literate societies. The Realschulen grew to meet industrial economy's need for technical training. Universities, though politically supervised, maintained high academic standards. German scholarship in history, philosophy, and science gained international recognition. This educational excellence provided human capital for economic development, while also creating critical thinking that challenged established order. The role of women showed modest change during the Confederation era. While excluded from political participation and most professions, women gained some economic opportunities through industrialization. Female workers, paid far less than men, were employed in textile factories and domestic service. Middle-class women, though confined to domestic sphere, exercised influence through charitable organizations and cultural activities. A few pioneers like Fanny Lewald began advocating for women's education and rights, though their impact remained limited. Cultural achievements during this period established German preeminence in music and scholarship. Felix Mendelssohn and Robert Schumann composed romantic masterpieces. Richard Wagner began creating his revolutionary music dramas. German universities attracted students from around the world. Leopold von Ranke established history as a scientific discipline based on primary sources. Alexander von Humboldt's scientific explorations expanded human knowledge of natural world. This cultural flowering enhanced Prussian and German prestige, even when political influence seemed limited. The army's development during the Confederation era prepared for future victories. Despite treaty limitations and budget constraints, military reformers maintained professional excellence. The General Staff, systematically studying past campaigns and potential future conflicts, developed strategic doctrine that emphasized rapid mobilization and decisive engagement. New technologies, rifled artillery, breech-loading rifles, telegraph communications were carefully evaluated and integrated. The army remained separate from society, loyal to crown rather than constitution, yet increasingly recognized as the ultimate guarantor of Prussian power. By 1860, as Frederick William IV's mental deterioration required his brother William to assume regency, Prussia stood at a crossroads. The Confederation structure that had contained Prussian ambitions for 45 years was weakening. Austrian power was declining due to internal problems and external defeats. German nationalism, suppressed but not destroyed after 1848, sought new expression. Industrial development had created a dynamic economy that strained against political restrictions. The stage was set for dramatic transformation that would unite Germany under Prussian leadership, though few could have predicted the speed and completeness of coming changes. Bismarck and the Wars of Unification. Otto von Bismarck's appointment as Prussian Minister-President on September 23, 1862, seemed an act of desperation by King William I, who had succeeded his brother in 1861. The Prussian Parliament refused to approve military budget increases. The king considered essential, creating a constitutional crisis that threatened to escalate into revolution or royal abdication. Bismarck, known as an ultra-conservative Junker with a reputation for blunt speech and diplomatic skill, appeared to be the king's last hope to break the deadlock. Few imagined this provincial nobleman would transform not just Prussia, but all of Europe. Bismarck's first speech to the Budget Committee on September 30th, 1862, shocked liberals with its brutal honesty about power politics. The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions, he declared, but by blood and iron. This phrase, which would define his historical image, was actually a diplomatic blunder that alarmed even conservatives. Yet it accurately expressed Bismarck's understanding that German unification required military force to overcome Austrian opposition and particularist resistance. The constitutional crisis that brought Bismarck to power revealed fundamental tensions in Prussian society. Liberals dominated the elected lower house of parliament, demanding genuine constitutional government with ministerial responsibility to the legislature. The military reform proposed by War Minister Albrecht von Roon would expand the army and extend service terms, requiring tax increases the Liberals opposed. They feared strengthening the military would entrench authoritarian rule and prevent democratic development. The deadlock seemed irreconcilable through normal political processes. Bismarck's solution was breathtakingly simple and constitutionally dubious. He declared that when Parliament and Crown disagreed on the budget, the government must continue functioning based on previous authorizations. Taxes were collected and military reforms implemented despite parliamentary opposition. Liberals raged against this constitutional violation, but Bismarck calculated correctly that they would not resort to revolutionary violence. The Prussian middle class wanted political influence, but feared social disorder more than royal authoritarianism. While defying Parliament domestically, Bismarck pursued careful diplomatic preparation for eventual conflict with Austria. He understood that Prussia could not defeat Austria if other great powers intervened. His strategy required isolating Austria diplomatically while appearing defensive rather than aggressive. This meant maintaining good relations with Russia, neutralizing France, keeping Britain disinterested, and preventing smaller German states from effectively supporting Austria. The Polish uprising of 1863 provided Bismarck's first opportunity to demonstrate diplomatic skill. While Britain and France expressed sympathy for Polish independence, Bismarck immediately supported Russian suppression. The Alvensleben Convention pledged Prussian assistance against Polish rebels, earning Russian gratitude that would prove valuable later. Liberals condemned this support for autocracy against national liberation, but Bismarck prioritized strategic advantage over ideological consistency. Liberals condemned this support for autocracy against national liberation, but Bismarck prioritized strategic advantage over ideological consistency. The Danish War of 1864 over Schleswig-Holstein offered the perfect opportunity to begin the unification process while maintaining a defensive appearance. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, personally ruled by the Danish king but not part of Denmark, had complex legal status and mixed German-Danish populations. When Denmark attempted to incorporate Schleswig in violation of international agreements, German nationalism demanded action. Bismarck brilliantly manoeuvred Austria into joint action with Prussia, knowing that cooperative occupation would inevitably create conflicts. The war itself demonstrated Prussian military superiority that surprised European observers. Prussian needle guns, breech-loading rifles that could be fired rapidly from prone position, devastated Danish forces armed with traditional muzzle loaders. Prussian artillery, produced by Krupp steelworks, showed superior range and accuracy. The General Staff's meticulous planning ensured smooth mobilization and supply. The Danish forces, though brave, were overwhelmed by Prussian technical and organisational superiority. The war ended quickly with Danish defeat, leaving Prussia and Austria to administer the conquered duchies jointly. The administration of Schleswig-Holstein created exactly the tensions Bismarck anticipated. Austria governed Holstein while Prussia controlled Schleswig, but this geographic separation caused constant friction. Bismarck deliberately provoked disputes over administration, knowing that Austria, financially weak and distracted by internal problems, could not maintain the partnership indefinitely. He simultaneously negotiated with Italy, promising Venetia in exchange for military alliance against Austria. Napoleon III of France, whom Bismarck met at Biarritz in 1865, was vaguely promised territorial compensation for French neutrality. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866, also known as the 7 Weeks' War, demonstrated Bismarck's strategic genius and Prussian military excellence. When Austria brought the Schleswig-Holstein dispute to the German Confederation, violating agreements with Prussia, Bismarck declared the Confederation dissolved and invaded Austrian allied German states. The speed of Prussian mobilization, using railways to concentrate forces rapidly, caught opponents unprepared. Most German states supported Austria, but their armies were scattered and uncoordinated. The Battle of Königgrätz on July 3, 1866, decided the war in a single day. 3 Prussian armies converged on Austrian forces in Bohemia, with precise timing that reflected superior staff work. The needle gun's rapid fire devastated Austrian infantry attacking in traditional formations. Prussian artillery, positioned by forward observers using telescopes, dominated the battlefield. Though Austrian cavalry and artillery fought well, and the battle remained uncertain until Crown Prince Frederick's army arrived at the crucial moment, Prussian victory was decisive. Austria lost 20,000 killed and wounded, plus 20,000 captured, while Prussian casualties were under 9,000. Bismarck's moderation after victory surprised everyone, including King William, who wanted to march triumphantly into Vienna. Bismarck understood that humiliating Austria would create permanent enmity and might trigger French intervention. The Peace of Prague excluded Austria from German affairs, but took no Austrian territory except Venetia, which went to Italy. Northern German states were incorporated into a new North German Confederation under Prussian leadership, while southern German states remained independent but signed military alliances with Prussia. This settlement achieved Prussian objectives while leaving room for future reconciliation with Austria. The North German Confederation, established in 1867, created the framework for future German unity. Its constitution, drafted by Bismarck, balanced authoritarian and democratic elements. The Bundesrat, representing state governments, held ultimate sovereignty, but the Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, controlled the budget. The Prussian king served as hereditary president with control over foreign policy and military command. Bismarck, as federal chancellor responsible only to the king, directed government policy. This structure preserved Prussian dominance, while giving other states and the people limited participation. The introduction of universal male suffrage surprised liberals who had opposed Bismarck's authoritarian methods. But Bismarck calculated that rural voters would support conservative candidates, while the vote would reconcile workers to the system. He also understood that democratic legitimacy would strengthen the new confederation internationally. The Reichstag's actual power remained limited, unable to remove the chancellor or control foreign policy, but its existence marked significant political evolution. Economic integration accelerated under the North German Confederation. Common currency, standardized weights and measures, and unified commercial law facilitated trade and investment. The Zollverein was incorporated into the Confederation structure. industrial development accelerated, particularly in armaments and related industries. The economic benefits of unification became apparent even to those who had opposed Prussian dominance politically. Southern German states, though formally independent, were increasingly drawn into this Prussian-dominated economic sphere. The question of southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, remained unresolved. These states, with significant Catholic populations and particular traditions, resisted Prussian Protestant dominance. France, viewing further German unification as threatening, actively supported southern German independence. Bismarck knew that incorporating these states required either their voluntary adhesion or a national crisis that would overcome particularist resistance. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 provided that crisis, though historians still debate whether Bismarck deliberately provoked it or merely exploited opportunities. The immediate cause was the Spanish succession crisis. When the Spanish throne was offered to Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a relative of the Prussian king, France objected vehemently, seeing encirclement by Hohenzollern rulers. Although Leopold withdrew his candidacy under French pressure, Napoleon III's government demanded guarantees that no Hohenzollern would ever accept the Spanish throne. The Ems dispatch of July 13, 1870 became Bismarck's tool for war. King William, taking waters at Bad Ems, met with French ambassador Benedetti and politely refused to provide the demanded guarantees. The king's report to Bismarck described this encounter in measured terms. Bismarck, editing the dispatch for publication, removed diplomatic language to make it appear that the king had curtly dismissed the French ambassador, while the ambassador had been improperly insistent. Both French and German public opinion was inflamed, with France declaring war on July 19, 1870. French declaration of war was exactly what Bismarck wanted, making France appear the aggressor and activating defensive alliances with southern German states. The French army, considered Europe's finest, was expected to march quickly into southern Germany. Instead, Prussian mobilization, perfected through years of planning, concentrated forces on the frontier with stunning speed. Southern German forces, honouring alliance obligations, joined the Prussian-led armies. German nationalism, transcending state boundaries, united against foreign invasion. The war's opening battles demonstrated overwhelming German military superiority. At Speicheren and Worth on August 6, 1870, German forces defeated French armies, despite tactical mistakes. The French chassepot rifle was superior to the Prussian needle gun, but German artillery dominated battlefields. More importantly, German leadership and organisation proved superior. French commanders, brave but strategically inept, were consistently outmanoeuvred by German forces operating according to comprehensive staff plans. The Battle of Sedan on September 1, 1870, was catastrophic for France. Emperor Napoleon III, personally commanding despite illness, was surrounded with his entire army. German artillery, positioned on surrounding heights, methodically destroyed French positions. French cavalry charges, magnificent but futile, were slaughtered by rifle fire. Napoleon's surrender, with over 100,000 troops, effectively ended the French Empire. The news sparked revolution in Paris, where the Third Republic was proclaimed on September 4, 1870. The siege of Paris from September 1870 to January 1871 demonstrated both French determination and German organisational capability. The new Republican government, led by Léon Gambetta, attempted to continue resistance, raising new armies in the provinces. But these hastily trained forces could not match German veterans. Paris, surrounded and bombarded, suffered terrible privation. Residents were reduced to eating rats and zoo animals. The siege's end on January 28, 1871, marked France's effective defeat, though sporadic resistance continued. The proclamation of the German Empire at Versailles on January 18, 1871, fulfilled Bismarck's grand design. The ceremony, held in the Hall of Mirrors exactly 170 years after Prussia became a kingdom, saw King William I proclaimed German Emperor. The choice of Versailles, symbol of French glory, emphasized German triumph. Southern German princes, swept up in nationalist enthusiasm and recognizing inevitable reality, joined the new empire. German unity, sought by liberals through persuasion and democracy, was achieved through Prussian blood and iron. The Treaty of Frankfurt on May 10, 1871, imposed harsh terms on defeated France. Alsace and northern Lorraine, with their German-speaking populations and valuable resources, were annexed to Germany. France paid an indemnity of 5 billion francs, an enormous sum that Germans assumed would cripple France for decades. German troops would occupy northern France until payment was complete. These terms, while satisfying German nationalism and military security concerns, created lasting French resentment that would poison European relations. Bismarck's success in unifying Germany transformed European politics fundamentally. The new German Empire, with its disciplined army, dynamic economy, and strategic central position, upset the balance of power maintained since 1815. France, humiliated and seeking revenge, would never reconcile to German dominance. Austria, excluded from Germany, turned toward the Balkans, creating new tensions with Russia. Britain, previously unconcerned with continental affairs, began viewing German power as potentially threatening. The seeds of future conflict were sown in the moment of German triumph. Prussia within the German Empire. The relationship between Prussia and the newly created German Empire was complex and sometimes paradoxical. Prussia had created Germany, yet in doing so, it began to lose its distinct identity. The Prussian king was now German emperor. The Prussian army became the German army, and Prussian administrators governed not just their traditional territories, but an entire nation. This transformation raised fundamental questions about identity, power, and purpose that would persist until Prussia's formal dissolution after World War II. The constitutional structure of the German Empire, carefully designed by Bismarck, ensured Prussian dominance while maintaining the fiction of federal equality. Prussia controlled 17 of the 58 votes in the Bundesrat, enough to block any constitutional amendment. The Prussian minister-president automatically served as imperial chancellor. The Prussian war ministry controlled most military matters. Yet this dominance created resentment among other German states, particularly Bavaria, Saxony and Württemberg, which retained their own kings, armies and administrative structures. William I, German Emperor and King of Prussia, embodied the tensions of this dual identity. He had reluctantly accepted the imperial title, preferring his traditional Prussian crown. He continued living in the modest Prussian royal palace rather than building a grand imperial residence. His daily routine remained that of a Prussian officer: early rising, military inspections, simple meals, and methodical attention to duty. This austere style contrasted sharply with the pomp expected of a European emperor, but it reinforced the image of Prussian discipline and dedication. The Kulturkampf, Bismarck's struggle against Catholic influence from 1871 to 1878, revealed deep divisions within the new empire. Bismarck viewed Catholicism, with its allegiance to Rome and strength in southern Germany and Polish territories, as threatening imperial unity. Laws expelled Jesuits, placed education under state control, and required civil marriage ceremonies. Priests who resisted were imprisoned or exiled. Yet this persecution backfired spectacularly. The Catholic Centre Party grew stronger through opposition. Catholic communities united against Protestant Prussian oppression. Bismarck eventually retreated, recognizing that internal religious conflict weakened rather than strengthened the empire. Economic transformation during the imperial period was spectacular and disorienting. The French war indemnity triggered a speculative boom known as the Gründerzeit, the founding era. New companies proliferated, railways expanded rapidly, and cities grew explosively. Berlin transformed from a provincial capital of 500,000 in 1871 to a world metropolis of 2 million by 1900. The Ruhr Valley became Europe's industrial heartland, its coal mines and steel mills producing more than Britain's. Yet this rapid growth also brought financial crashes, social dislocation, and environmental degradation that challenged traditional Prussian values of order and stability. The rise of industrial capitalism created new social classes that didn't fit traditional Prussian categories. Industrial magnates like the Krupp family wielded economic power exceeding that of many nobles, yet lacked aristocratic status. The growing middle class of professionals, managers, and bureaucrats demanded political influence, commensurate with their economic importance. Industrial workers concentrated in vast factories and urban slums developed class consciousness that threatened the established order. These new forces required accommodation within a system designed for a simpler, more hierarchical society. The Social Democratic Party's growth represented the greatest challenge to Prussian-dominated conservative order. Founded in 1875, it combined Marxist theory with practical demands for workers' rights. Despite Bismarck's anti-socialist laws from 1878 to 1890, which banned socialist meetings, publications, and organizations, the party grew stronger. Social Democrats won increasing numbers of Reichstag seats, though the electoral system's bias toward rural districts limited their influence. The party's existence raised fundamental questions about whether the Prussian-German system could accommodate democratic socialism or would face revolutionary overthrow. Bismarck's response to the socialist threat combined repression with paternalistic reform. While suppressing socialist political activity, he introduced the world's first comprehensive social insurance system. Sickness insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, and old age pensions in 1889 provided workers with security unknown elsewhere. These measures, designed to reconcile workers to the existing order, became models for welfare states worldwide. Yet they also reflected genuine Prussian tradition of state responsibility for subjects' welfare, updated for industrial conditions. The army's role in Imperial Germany perpetuated and intensified Prussian military traditions. Universal male conscription created a nation in arms, with every man serving 2 or 3 years of active duty, followed by reserve obligations. The officer corps remained dominated by Prussian nobility, maintaining its separate legal system and direct loyalty to the emperor rather than constitution. Military values, obedience, discipline, hierarchy permeated society through veterans' associations, school curricula, and public ceremonies. Critics spoke of militarism, but supporters saw necessary preparation for defending the new empire. Educational development during the imperial period built on Prussian foundations while adapting to industrial needs. Primary education was universal and compulsory, creating near-total literacy. The gymnasium system prepared elite students for university through rigorous classical education. Technical high schools and trade schools trained the engineers and skilled workers essential for industrial economy. German universities, following the research model established by Wilhelm von Humboldt, became world leaders in science and scholarship. This educational excellence provided human capital for economic growth while reinforcing social stratification. The relationship between Junker aristocracy and industrial bourgeoisie evolved in complex ways. Traditional landed nobles initially scorned industry and commerce as beneath their dignity. But economic pressures forced adaptation. Some Junkers invested in industrial enterprises or married wealthy bourgeois heiresses. Successful industrialists purchased estates and sought noble titles, creating a hybrid elite combining old status with new wealth. This gradual fusion, though incomplete and tension-filled, prevented the sharp class conflicts that revolutionary Marxists predicted. Women's position in Imperial Germany showed both continuity with Prussian tradition and pressure for change. The ideal of the German Hausfrau, devoted to children, church and kitchen, remained powerful. Women were excluded from universities until 1908 and from political participation entirely. Yet industrialization created new opportunities and necessities. Working-class women laboured in factories and domestic service. Middle-class women increasingly worked as teachers, nurses, and office workers before marriage. The women's movement, though divided between moderate and radical wings, began demanding education, professional opportunities, and eventually political rights. Cultural life during the imperial period showed creative tension between Prussian tradition and modern innovation. Richard Wagner's operas, celebrating Germanic myth while employing revolutionary musical techniques, embodied this duality. Berlin's museums and concert halls showcased both classical heritage and contemporary art. The Prussian Academy of Arts maintained conservative standards, while younger artists formed secessionist movements. Literature ranged from Theodor Fontane's realistic novels about Prussian society to naturalist dramas challenging social conventions. This cultural ferment reflected broader tensions between tradition and modernity. The reign of Frederick III in 1888, lasting only 99 days before his death from throat cancer, represented a might-have-been in German history. Frederick, married to Queen Victoria's daughter and influenced by British liberalism, might have moved Germany toward genuine parliamentary democracy. His son William II, who succeeded him at age 29, represented a very different vision of imperial power, one that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. William II's character and policies marked a departure from Prussian tradition, even while claiming to embody it. Where Prussian kings had been austere and hard-working, William was flamboyant and erratic. His dismissal of Bismarck in 1890 removed the steady hand that had guided German policy. His naval-building programme challenged Britain unnecessarily. His bombastic speeches about German world power alarmed other nations. Yet William also promoted economic modernisation, scientific research, and social reform, creating a contradictory legacy that historians still debate. The Prussian administrative system within Imperial Germany maintained its reputation for efficiency and honesty. The civil service, recruited through competitive examinations and promoted by merit, provided stable governance, despite political turbulence. Local administration in Prussian provinces balanced centralized control with regional variation. The legal system, though harsh by modern standards, was generally impartial and predictable. This administrative competence enabled Germany's rapid modernization, but also facilitated authoritarian control and limited democratic development. Economic growth during the late imperial period was extraordinary. Germany surpassed Britain in steel production and challenged American industrial supremacy. German chemical and electrical industries led the world in innovation. The merchant marine competed globally. Agricultural modernization increased productivity despite rural population decline. This economic success created national pride and international influence, but also generated tensions with established powers who viewed German growth as threatening. The Polish minority in Prussian eastern provinces faced intensified Germanization efforts during the imperial period. The Settlement Commission purchased Polish estates for German colonization. Polish language was banned from schools and public administration. The Catholic Church, vital to Polish identity, faced restrictions. Yet these policies largely failed. Polish national consciousness strengthened through resistance. Birth rates remained higher among Poles than Germans. The eastern provinces remained a source of tension and instability that would contribute to future conflicts. Urban growth transformed Prussian society in fundamental ways. Berlin became not just Germany's political capital, but its cultural and economic centre. Industrial cities like Essen and Dortmund grew from small towns to major metropolitan areas within decades. This urbanization broke traditional social bonds, created anonymity unknown in rural communities, and generated new social problems. Housing shortages, pollution, crime, and disease challenged municipal governments. Yet cities also offered opportunities for social mobility, cultural innovation, and political organization impossible in traditional rural society. The relationship between Prussia and other German states within the empire evolved over time. Initial resentment at Prussian dominance gradually gave way to acceptance and even pride in German unity. Regional identities remained strong. Bavarians, Saxons, and others maintained their distinctive cultures, but shared experiences, particularly military service and economic integration, created genuine German national identity. By 1900, most Germans, even those critical of Prussian dominance, couldn't imagine returning to the fragmented Germany of the past. Colonial expansion from the 1880s onward represented a departure from traditional Prussian continental focus. Bismarck had initially opposed colonies as expensive distractions, but public pressure and economic interests drove acquisition of territories in Africa and the Pacific. German colonial administration, applying Prussian bureaucratic methods to very different contexts, achieved some economic development but also committed serious abuses, particularly the genocide of the Herero and Namakwa peoples in German Southwest Africa. Colonialism never became central to German identity as it did for Britain or France, remaining a late and ultimately temporary addition to German power. The naval building program initiated under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz in 1898 marked a fundamental strategic shift. Prussia had traditionally been a land power, with the navy serving merely coastal defence. The new battle fleet aimed to challenge British naval supremacy, reflecting William II's ambition for world power. This naval expansion absorbed enormous resources, alarmed Britain into closer relations with France and Russia, and ultimately failed to provide decisive advantage in war. It represented the triumph of imperial ambition over Prussian strategic prudence. By 1914, Prussia within the German Empire presented a complex picture of triumph and tension. The state that had unified Germany through military prowess now found its identity subsumed within the larger nation. Prussian virtues of discipline, efficiency, and duty had enabled Germany's spectacular rise, but also created rigidities that hindered adaptation to changing circumstances. The aristocratic military elite that had led unification struggled to accommodate democratic and socialist challenges. Economic modernization had created wealth and power, but also social conflicts that traditional methods couldn't resolve. Prussia had succeeded in creating Germany, but whether it could successfully govern this creation remained an open question as Europe moved toward the catastrophe of World War I